So once again, welcome. I'm Collier Nogues. I am here with Nicholas Wong, who is a poet from Hong Kong. And if you weren't here for the reading, just very quickly, his books include Crevasse, which won the Lambda Award for Gay Poetry, and Besiege Me, which was shortlisted for the same prize. His work has won multiple other international awards, and he's also a visual artist. So I may ask you to talk a little bit about the images that were behind you when you were reading. Those are Nick's works. And he's a senior lecturer at the Education University of Hong Kong. And then also Lawrence Lacambra Ypil, who is from Cebu, Philippines, and his books are The Experiment of the Tropics and The Highest Hiding Place. The Experiment of the Tropics was a winner of the Gaudy Boy Book Prize and also shortlisted for the Lambda Award. He read also from two chapbooks, which I think we may be talking about as well. And he's a senior lecturer at Yale NUS in Singapore. So I'm very happy to welcome them to talk with us this afternoon. And my first question is about locality in your writing. And this is partly because I know, Larry, you've been thinking about Southeast Asian localities, but also more specifically all the way down to a single house, as we were talking about with the sentimental during the thought of the house. And Nick, when we were talking about what questions might be raised in the symposium, the question you asked was, how Asian is Asian poetry? This is like a gigantic, is that a locality? I don't know. But so I'm curious if you guys would talk a little bit about what locality means to you. If you think of, maybe this is a question that makes sense. Is Asian, is that a term which refers to space, to locality, or to other things for you and your sense of yourselves as poets? Maybe we could start there.
I gave Collier the question probably because of a very personal reason. That is something that I kept thinking about when I read poems by Asian American poets published these days. How should I put it without offending people? I need to be more tactful. You asked me to go first. No, I think, besides, because, okay, I think we have all gone through the stage of talking about being between languages, being between cultures, trying to trace back our origin, things like that. But I'm thinking whether there's a possibility of finding another way to write about an Asian poem in English without talking about any of those. And if a poem like that is written and submitted to a publication, would that be a disadvantage or an advantage? Because I've noticed that some publications in the States, mostly, they do like people treating their identity as a spectacle. And I think, I was trying to be, okay, so is there another way to write about that? Write about, you as who you are without talking too much, quote unquote, about, languages or motherland or mothers or ethnicity and cultural roots. So I was trying to explore that area in my own work as well. Yep. So I wonder what Larry would think about this.
Maybe just to add to that, I feel like categories can help, but categories can also limit. And I'm saying that as someone who navigates those categories, right? So whether that be, are you queer poet or are you just poet? Like, are you queer poet or just poet? And I'm like, I don't know. Are you Filipino poet? Are you Cebuano poet? These categories help make us legible, but I also feel like all categories, we move in and out of them at different points of our writing. On the question of place, I've always felt most inspired when I'm thinking about my parents' hometowns. That's one. So the question of place for me is tied to the question of where are you from? Where are your parents from? and where did they consider home? I wonder if I'm fascinated with that because my generation has been faced by a lot of movement and migration, whereas my parents were a bit more fixed and located. So in a way, maybe it's their sense of a fixed home that has been both romanticized by my imagination, but also I feel like that's getting less and less common, and therefore they're precious. So in certain ways, just to maybe respond to your question, it's a sense of origin that's been important to me. I also feel like it's important to just look at those places and really just look at them and look at the stories that are coming out of them without any kind of agenda, without thinking whether they're national, international, or local. I think the moment we embrace the material we're dealt with, and that we really have the guts to face it, then things become infinitely more complex without even our like. I say that because like the moment I started writing about my uncle, who is a Catholic bishop, but also like was very tied to the political family that was problematic, I was just like, oh my gosh, my uncle. He was the confessor of the mayor. And I only found that out when I saw a biography of the problematic mayor. And the first person he thanks was just like Father Ypil, who is my confessor. And I was like, uncle. Uncle. And he's still alive. I mean, he's still alive. I interviewed him. I visited him. Ventanilla is partly about that uncle. I love him to bits. But it's those complicated things, right? Like, is that a local story? Is that a national story? Is that an international story? Partly you're just like, who cares? You have an interesting uncle. Talk to him. You know, and it took me a while to show him. I did not tell him I wrote about him at all. Until Christmas time came and I still don't have gift for uncle. So I will give uncle the gift of Ventanilla. And he calls me up and he says like, great writing. And I was like, wow, everyone really just wants to be written about. So like, all solved, nothing political was mentioned. I think I bring him up as a case because I think part of choosing what to write about is partly out of heritage and circumstance, right? Who we get to talk to, who we choose to talk to, is super important. Whose stories do we listen to? Sorry, I don't think I answered your question, Collier, but
I just want you to talk and say smart stuff, and I think that's happening, so I'm not worried about it.
it's a question of who you choose to listen to. Yeah.
Well, to kind of follow up on this, Nick, so I feel like you were touching on a thread that Dorothy brought up this morning, and Will and Don Me, identity poetics versus maybe more linguistic play. Like we have this sort of opposition, which is not really an opposition. But I thought it was very interesting that Will seemed to describe a sort of fragmented approach and a surface approach of connection with identity, which seemed to have a relationship with your experience of identity. Or okay, this is not being very clear. But the idea that being asked to represent an identity is like a foreign proposition, and instead what you maybe can represent it in poetics is a sort of fragmentation of other people you have felt connected to because they also had a sort of a fragmented background or not a specific Indonesian ethnic background. Apologize for garbling. I feel like now I'm your like AI, your Google transcription. But I had a thought and it was like partially formed. But this question of whether there is another way to write a poem, which we would call an Asian poem, which is not about origin, which is not about representing identity or legibility, or the Chinese poem about nature, or the Asian poem about nature, like all of this is very related. But that brings me back to one of the lines in your poem when you said fragments get things done, which is kind of interesting. It seems like your approach, at least in this reading, was to work with fragments as a way to make this happen.
I think I'm more interested in how I can sequence my work within a time limit. That's what I told you over the email, right? I'm really happy, about participating in this because I was given a chance to really create myself and my work. for 20 minutes. So what should I put in there, and how should I sequence that? And I realized that, okay, for 20 minutes is a long time, to read. Yes, right. So I have to, in Chinese we call it 記憶點, right? We have to have moments for people to remember. And I don't have a novel that has a chapter that I can read for 20 minutes. So a long poem, a short poem is also a fragment. And maybe it's also because of how I think as well, associating moments rather than, highlighting the coherence. I like fragments. I like poems, especially when they are written as one huge chunky stanza, but then that's why I like Dean Young's work, very incoherent, but yet you can follow that. You can derive something out of the incoherence, the realistic association of images as well. I'll just let the fragments speak for themselves. I can't derive I can't impose a linear timeline onto those fragments, given what happened personally and also to the world with pandemic since 2019 and 20. So I think the fragments would best be themselves as what they are. Yeah. Did I answer? No, I didn't answer the questions.
Well, as a formal strategy, right? To sort of think about creating a self for a performance. This is, yeah. That seems quite resonant.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Fragments.
Maybe the counterpoint for me to that would be kind of the long sentence. Yes. Right? The sentence that's too long for its own good. The sentence that tries to do too much. I think when writing Experiment, that was particularly important for me to find like a breathlessness. I loved the sentence that kind of like did 2 or 3 more things than you thought it would do. Like it was like an extra adjective, another phrase. Let's put a participial, like you to use your grammar, and to kind of like push for a sentence that would move you somewhere else was very important, actually, at the level of craft, to understand that was the kind of sentence I was working with. I think it's a sentence I also got from early 20th century anthropological texts about the Philippines, completely problematic texts, but in my head, very beautifully written texts. We're talking like early 20th century writing by white anthropologists attempting to describe and classify Filipinos, right? Which we would now very clearly see now as problematic and racist. But to my poet's ear, there were early 20th century sentences are great. They're long, they're filled with stuff, in a way that I think we prize the clear short sentence too much now. Like, I want to bring back the long sentence. But I think that's part of the joy of poetry, to think on those terms, and just to see where it goes. So I love the fragments too, but I also like when they're like a long thread and then you just like 2 or 3 more things. Yeah.
I think I'm more drawn to fragments because English is my second language, and I wish I could be as eloquent as you are. Yeah. Every time you read something, even though that is a very small paragraph, you know where to put the weight. You know you do.
But you do also, Nick, right? Like
I don't.
Huh.
So if I'm not that well crafted in my L2, I have to find my own way to play around and with fragments in a way that only I can do, and I'm happy about, and that excites me and that keeps me going. Yeah.
I'm gonna take that.
So, you brought up looking. I think, Nick, you mentioned looking. There's a lot about looking in both of your work. Of course, Larry, you were very explicit about that in your reading, talking about discovering that this project, The Experiment of the Tropics, was about being looked at by photographs, or yourself looking at the photograph, looking back at you, thinking about that experience, not just you looking at the picture. And also, I think you said this is a photograph. It's a photograph of you. It's a photograph of me, with the looker the speaker, the speakee. We're thinking again about this relationship, right? The lookie, the looker. And Nick, so much in your work is so visual. I'm thinking now about the city, which is so, you say, it seems aware of everyone who lives alone, or it knows who lives alone at every level. There's a feeling of spectating, of being spectated, being seen in your work. And I know you're also a visual artist. So as I said, I would love to hear you say a little bit about the images, but then after that, I hope we can talk somewhat about the role visuality plays in your work for both of you. Nick, can I ask you to talk about that first?
The line about the city seemed to know where. Sorry, the city seemed to know who lived alone at every conceivable level. That's actually from the Erasure of Andrew Holleran's novel, Grief. I find myself grieving a lot since my dog died in 2020. So, so one day in my office, I had a couple of hours between classes, and I don't want to reply emails. So I look at my bookshelf, and there was a very thin novel, Grief, that I read a long time ago. So I photocopied the entire book. You're recording. I didn't photocopy the entire book, and then erased the novel, and then I just left it there until half a year ago. I think I found what I did about the novel. So I tried to put things together and to make to see whether I could make a poem or sequence of lines out of it. And that was the moment when I felt I couldn't write. I started drawing or pretending to be an artist because I wanted to go beyond the dimension of a paper. I wanted to see my language done onto a different surface, or maybe of a different scale. Also because I couldn't rely on another person to collaborate with me. I find that I don't have the IT skills, I don't have the photoshopping skills, I don't know how to edit a video or to use AI, or take a photo or take a photograph. So basically skillless. So I had to maybe force myself to explore some of that as well. But ironically, I found myself working the best with paper. I still can't find a way to work around with canvases. I don't know why. I'm still on paper. The cheaper the paper, the more excited I am. I think there's something sadistic about it. I bought paper from Kyoto, expensive handmade Japanese paper. Every time I unrolled it, I better not touch it. I don't know why I have this pressure. So I have the images that you saw. The images that you saw were actually on a series of paperwork that I did on that erasure sequence. I made 36 pieces, and I suddenly one day found some papers left over from my studio artist friend, given to me. I found a pile, yellowish. I don't know what paper they are. So I was playing around with different kind of medium. The blue one, the first one, yes. This is actually watercolor mixed with lubricant. Yeah. And I chose to include the typewritten text instead of hand writing them, because I realized that if I go for this style, my work will look like Cy Wombley's paintings, handwritten and then slap of paints here and there. So I don't want to make people feel like that, so I have to rely on a typewriter at some point. And I realized that I cannot paint words, even with stencils, because I was painting words, not writing the words. There's no forwardness or momentum or meaning in the process. I don't know why. So that's the visual aspect. I was trying to see what I can do with, yeah, that's part of, yeah.
What's the role of visual art or visuality for you, Larry? Talk more about looking.
Just suddenly thinking like it's I too work. I don't paint. I don't imagine myself drawing at all. Like a stick figure is the best I can do. So like you just know what you can't do, right? Like that's again I can't do that. I have to say it's been a pleasure working with visual artists. I think I've appreciated the ways they create things in ways that I think writers were too obsessed with meaning a bit too much. So it's been great to not to think of words in ways outside of or in addition to their meaning. In other words, like how they look or where they're found. Part of the archival pleasure is also the archive of handwriting, right? So some of these photographs have messages written behind them, and I think that's part of kind of like the archive. It's not just the visual; it's the kind of writing that happens around the visual. So with many of the photographs I've worked with, early 20th century, strong tradition of writing behind the photo, a dedication, right? Mostly a really cliche English verse of like, dear so and so, you know, your face reminds me of whatever. So and I find that part of the material that I'm working with. It's part of the acoustic material too. So the visual, while for example the photographs are primarily visual, I have to say that in the process of writing the poems, I almost felt like I was trying to listen to the photograph. That's the closest I can get to describing the process. It felt like I was looking at it, but I also felt like I needed to hear it or hear myself looking at it. Um, I know that sounds weird, but that's how these poems were written. I wonder if it's because I also grew up watching a lot of TV with my brother beside me. I grew up in the 80s, right? So like everyone watched TV, and like that sensation of just looking and listening, I think is part of my experience of words. So while I know I'm dealing with really old black and white stuff, there's a part of me that's really 1980s also, Technicolor, and watching like soap operas, you know, and just like that experience of looking but also listening is part of poetry for me. Yeah, that's I think my experience of the visual too. Yeah, not painting, not high art, kind of like Knight Rider and Wonder Woman on Wednesday evenings. Yeah.
Well, so this makes me wonder, Nick, you've written necrastic poems in response to specific works of art, video art, right? Like Elvis Yip, and also to Banksy's performance stunts with the shredded. What is it called? The painting is.
Love is, you know, Banksy's famous painting, Love is in the Bin, you know, with a girl holding a balloon, you know, and then, you know, once it's sold on Sotheby's and then
shredded
Yeah.
the instant it was sold, right? It's a couple years ago. So my question is, for you, do you find visual art to be like a regular source of inspiration or something that you are writing back to?
It could be. I think I am. I mean, as a poet, I think I found myself more. I found myself perform better as a poet when I have to react to something. So you know the source has to be external. It could be visual art. It could be a person. It could be a song. It could be anything. The most difficult kind of external stimulation would be the mother. I can't write about my mom, even though I tried. I think it's the emotional proximity that I have with her, given, you know, we are still living in the same home space. So does that answer your question? You know, so I went to, I remember the show. There's a show that happened in Parasite, the local gallery in Corey Bay. You know, that exhibition was about migrant workers, you know, and labor, and then there were a lot of very well done installations and art pieces there, and I remember, you know, I had to write about them back then. Yeah, so that was, I think, 2016 or something, or 15. Yeah.
You wrote about your mom, though.
I
Right?
tried,
Yeah.
but narratively though, narratively, like stating facts and happenings, but it's difficult to poeticize the mother. Why?
So I'm thinking of the we didn't get to read the latter section of Sentimental, but the chapbook actually ends with me and Zach talking about our moms, which I didn't realize until like I reread this 2 days ago preparing for the reading. I was just like, oh my gosh, this book ends with like two queer boys talking about their mother. I mean, what else is the queerest thing, right?
We all have mommy
what else do
issues.
queer boys talk about if not their mothers? But it ends with a kind of awe that we have about how independent they were. So it's also a kind of like tribute to mothers and queerness and the wrath and the tenderness that they bring to queer boys. Yeah. So I didn't want to move it to mothers, but Nick brought
can
it
do
up.
mothers. Well, okay, so
yeah.
here's the next question then. Have you written about your mother elsewhere? Or do you need to write about your mother and then have it garbled by Google Transcribe?
Is this the psychoanalytic portion of the
Yes,
interview?
welcome to the therapy part, yeah.
My answer is I too have a hard time about writing the mom. It's the father that's been easy to write about, to be honest. I've written a lot about my dad. I mean, my mom has complained, actually. She was like, you never write about me. And I couldn't tell her why. I also don't know why. The
What
one,
would
the
you
one time
say?
I did write about her and I asked her to read, she really went up to me and said like, no, you're misrepresenting me, Larry. That is not what really happened. I was just like, I give up. I try to write about you, but then you don't approve my writing about you. So I think they need to be garbled. I think the mother will refuse the straightforward sentence, at least to me. So I don't know if that's in any way related to the difficulty. So I don't know if I don't know if we should go there.
We can end the therapy session now. Okay, we're going to back to questions strictly about poetry and language. So now that we're talking about, I was sentimental during the thought of the house. So you have not done translation, but I mean,
I have a bit. I've done a bit.
You have done a bit.
Yeah.
Okay, Nick, you have. I mean, you read a couple of poems that you translated from the Taiwanese Mandarin. So I'm just kind of curious if you could talk a little bit about how your multiple languages come together in your writing. And I guess this is kind of an echo of the question Shamira, where she is asked in the first session. There she is. About how you arrive at the languages in your work. I'll end there and ask you.
Like what Will said, I'm also a very baby translator. Coincidentally, the Taiwanese friend that I translated wrote a book called in Chinese called Xin Dai Mantao, Shanti Mantou. He wanted to make the title sound like sentimental, but literally in Chinese it means like passing over the bun to someone else. I didn't set out to translate him professionally. I met him when I was in Taipei City, being their poet in residence for Taipei City International Poetry Festival, which is awesome, organized by Hong Hong and a bunch of very nice Taiwanese poets. So I had a chance to meet him, and then he gave me this book, and I didn't read it right away. It was until a year later that I found, there's a book I haven't read on my shelf, so it's by my friend. So I opened it, and then I think I got carried away by the way he handled images. Back then, I wasn't, and I still don't have much training in translation. I was trying to approach translation as a poet and as someone who knew him. So I found that was very necessary. And the good thing about him is that he never asked to take a look at the translation. But poems from this book, most of them are pretty straightforward. Sometimes if I encounter problems, I would email him and he would say something. He was a very kind person. Our friendship started back then. I find that homoerotic at some point because you're really digging into the life and the head of someone you just knew. And it's the most intimate thing you can ever do to a poet, I think. Given he doesn't really, he's not that prolific anymore because he has this full-time job as an editor at the Liberty Times in Taiwan. So he only writes like 2-3 poems a year now. So maybe I have maybe I have a look at his life within like 8-9 years here. So I think that's a very intimate thing, and mostly done out of friendship as an act of emotional bonding, rather than trying to get you translator. Let's get the American readers or the British readers know about your work. It's nothing like that. Although I still publish and submit his the translation of his poems for publications. Although I still do that, but it's not originally about that.
I really liked that question earlier, by the way. Like, how do we arrive at the language we write in? And for me, like, sometimes it's given to us by history. It's the language that we're given by history. I grew up in Cebu in the Philippines, which is in the central part of the Philippines, which means that in school we studied only Tagalog, the national language, and English. So at home and in the streets, Cebuano is the lingua franca. So until now, I don't really write in Cebuano, even if it's the language I speak to with my parents and a lot of my friends from there. So in a way, English is my written language by default almost of history. And in a way, I feel like I've come to try to own it in a way that it is also not mine. I mean, it's also not anyone's either. We're borrowing it from each other. I would also like to think that my poems are shaped by the music of Cebuano, even if not by the words. I suspect maybe that my accent really comes out when I'm reading the poems, and it might be a Cebuano accent. Who knows what the accent that is, but there's an accent that comes out. And like, while these are poems in English, I do feel like as I'm reciting them, there's a different music that comes behind it. And maybe it's Cebuano, maybe it's not. So it makes me think about things like accents and music and form that can really inform English, even not at the level of semantics, but at the level of sound. So in that way, it's like your language is also built out of many different things. That's why it's really interesting. Like, I'm super excited to hear everyone read today and tomorrow, because like I feel like this is a gathering of Englishes and accents too, and not in a way that accents can sometimes feel like a bad thing. Like, don't tell me I speak in an accent. Like, no, do tell me I speak in an accent. I love my accent, right? So like, what does it mean to like embrace that accent and to write with that accent? Is, I think, part of the challenge of writers that are writing in English coming from our part of the world. How do we not repress the things we've repressed all our lives? So bring those accents out.
Yeah, I mean, this touches on also what you said, Nick, as writing in L2, an L2 language, and you find the music through the fragments in a different way than Larry is working with these longer sentences. Have you ever self-translated your own work
Into
Chinese?
I can never do that.
No.
I tried, like the third character of the first line, I'm already stuck. I need someone to do it for me, and then maybe afterwards I would edit the work. Maybe it's not what I meant, something like that. But I had to have someone's voice take over. I don't know whether that's my limited Chinese ability, written Chinese proficiency, or what. I better have someone else do it. Yeah.
Well, that makes me think too of what you're talking about. It was a very kind of intimate relationship you had with the poet, with Sun Siping, that you translated, right? Like that was not about wanting to find a publishing marketplace. It was about a relationship that you were having. This is more important. You were just.
No, I'm just suddenly reminded that someone has translated some of my poems from English into Cebuano. They're largely unpublished. They're in box somewhere. But when I first read it, I was like, oh my gosh, they're so angry. Like in my head in English, they were like beautiful English poems. Like talking about my mother and like the father in the garden. And like the moment they were translated into Cebuano, I was just like, oh my God. Like what a dark childhood what a dark childhood this boy had. No, then there was really an anger and a resentment there that I did not realize before. And maybe English has that kind of like camouflage ability to make things feel like they're okay when they're not okay.
It's English's specialty.
Yeah, yeah. So I think there was an anger to history. There was a queer anger. There was an anger of a young boy that realized things were not built for him to thrive. That things were built against him. And I should have known that, right? Like, I mean, I wrote those poems, but like, it had to take someone writing in my mother tongue to like, whoa, like, who is this kid?
What was your relationship with your translator? Do you know them?
Oh,
You work with
yeah,
them?
yeah, he was a friend, and yeah, he really liked the book and said like, I'm gonna try translating it. Life got in the way, so there's somewhere around.
Well, this kind of I want to return to Nick, your translations from Sun Ziping's Sentimental in the English version.
I actually missed that up.
Is it
I thought he
Sentimentalist?
meant sentimental because there are 4 sounds in the title, right? 4 words. But when I try to submit something to the publisher or editors, do you want to have a look? I call the book Sentimentalist. I made a mistake, but then
It
it
was a
also makes sense, right?
nominalization.
Because it's about the poet being
Yeah.
sentimental. So, anyway, it doesn't really matter. He doesn't really care. Yeah.
He's fine with it.
Yeah.
So both of you, I mean, here we are. You both have written books with, translated poems, but written a book with sentimental in the title. When I was reviewing your work in preparation for this, I was like, well, that's a commonality that I wasn't really expecting to see. But then, Larry, you also said that you would maybe not just mind talking about feelings. And I guess we went there with the mothers earlier. But so my question for you is, what sentimentality? Well, what is it? What is sentiment? What is sentimentality? What place does it have in poetry for you? And kind of related to this question, what does it have to do with your sense of what home is? Because for you, you're thinking about it in terms of this house, which is lost, right? The lost house, the sort of childhood place that you were saturated in, but never really saw the religious iconography, for example. Nick, elsewhere you've asked this question. Sorry, I'm dragging out your words from an asymptote interview from a while ago. Why can a home repel and beg you to stay, and how can it be foreign and familiar at the same time? So thinking about your relationship to writing home and your sense of what sentiment, what sort of feeling that might be, and whether it's related to home, a sense of home, if you could speak on that a bit. Can you, or is it too complicated? It's a bit
I
later.
feel I should start, but it's a full.
You're the one with sentimental
I know,
house in the same
right,
title.
yes.
You can begin.
No, I'm suddenly reminded of Donmi this morning, who was asked about Korean history and like, where do you even start? I feel like it's made me. Like these questions about home is what makes me. I only started writing when I left Cebu to do undergrad in Manila. That's the first time I really wrote seriously. So the act of writing for me is really tied to like writing about home from afar. I don't think I would have been a writer if I had stayed in Cebu. That's what I feel. And yet, every time I'm back in Cebu, the first thing I do when I'm back home is write. And that's when I know it's home. Because the moment I'm back, I go straight to my room and my desk, and you feel it in ways that you don't feel it in other places. And you're just like, oh, this is the place that made me a writer. Right? And I think I consider myself lucky that that house still exists, that that room still exists. And every time I'm back, I feel like I'm in the headquarters of Lawrence Ypil, like memories from like everything is within reach in that space. Like time bends and folds in on itself, and you like, I have access to all my different places and times in my life. Um, I hope you have a room like that somewhere, because I feel like that's vital to me. But what I'm also suggesting is that I needed to leave it in order to begin writing. And I suspect it's that pendulum of leaving and returning that really fuels my writing. It was hard during the pandemic staying in one place, to be honest. I realized, oh, I was running on this back and forth. That was my fuel. It's not the best kind of fuel because it's tiring, but that was the fuel of the writing. You leave places, you return to it. And maybe that's my answer for home. It's not one of permanence. It's also not one of exile, right? Those two dramas are dramas I don't have access to. I am eternally in awe of people who live in places they were born in. I am envious of them. And then the whole idea of the exilic writer is tragic and romantic, but I also know like I'm being over dramatic if I say I'm in exile. I'm not, you know? So there are those of us that really just move between places. And like the things get written in the airport, in the train, in little notebooks. That's where the writing happens.
Do you feel it's important that when you left the Philippines as well? After, I mean, you went to Manila, but then you went to the U.S. to do degrees, and you're in Singapore now. Does it feel like it would be different if you were leaving and returning from within the same nation?
Yes. I think it was important for me to live a few years in the States. American poetry had been very influential to me as a writer growing up in the Philippines. So that kind of canon that we grew up with was important. I think Asian American poetry in particular. I think, Dorothy, you brought up Liang Lee this morning. He was the one for me when I was growing up in the Philippines and in Manila writing. There was something about Asian American writing that I recognized. In a way, it was like the closest queer writing. Like, for some reason, I wasn't too drawn to the queer writers. Yeah. I was drawn to Asian American writing that I think was articulating a kind of dislocation that I felt in the Philippines. So it was, in a way, it's formative to me. That's why like the writers like Liang Lee, Garrett Hongo, Marilyn Chin, all those on those like 90s anthologies, like I grew up with it in the Philippines, and I was just like, these writers are writing about something I really recognize. And it wasn't like I wanted to be American. It was like the Asian American sensibility had something to speak to me. So I think it was at that level important for me to like go there and speak to them. I remember finally meeting or seeing Naomi Shihab Nye, a Palestinian American, and like in the flesh. I literally leaped off like I almost accosted her, and she was quite frightened. But it is that kind of like recognition, right, of the writers you read, and having the chance to meet them face to face, the luck of that was important. But maybe also important to like leave it and return to this English, right, which is Hong Kong, Singapore, where I met you, right? We met in Manila, and to realize that there is this whole other network of conversations that are just waiting to happen. I don't think they've happened yet. I think they're just waiting to happen. That is shaped by the center, but is also like really built away and separate from it. And I think that's the dynamic we're talking about in this conference. Yeah, sorry to throw back the ball at you, but
that was the
that's
thesis.
what we're here.
We were looking
Yeah.
for a thesis. That's a thesis. Nick, do you want to follow?
Yeah, but do you want to say something about sentimental, or did you say that already?
You might have more to say.
I'm. Do I? I don't know.
Feelings are important.
Feelings are important.
Feelings are
Feelings are-
so important.
That's why I told my students. Two of my students are here, but more in the morning and the previous session as well, right? Because I told them, poetry is useless. It's a useless course at some point. but it's a unique course where you can apply your feelings. In an entire curriculum, I don't think we have enough recognition about like what do we do with the emotions and feelings in our education. You can feel how the language works, feel the images, feel the rhythm, feel the sound, but not like logically, asking, okay, what this line means and blah, blah, blah. I think feelings also give you a sense of understanding about the work in a different way. So I think I love poetry because it allows me to put feelings into something on paper. And since I was small, I don't know why I just listened to drama queen. I don't know. A lot of feelings to give away. To give away literally, like if I don't give the feelings away, just weight inside me, and it's not feeling good. So that's why I also turned to visual arts as well. When I couldn't do it with language anymore, I had to do it in some other ways. So I think it's already built in me since I was a kid. Aquarius, I'm Aquarius, right? So it's always very sentimental. So when I came to so when I started my MFA, I found it very strange that people talking about the lyric and sentimental. And why do you have two terms that explain what the genre is to me? Isn't poetry about sentimentality and feelings? Given what how limited I knew about what poetry could be. So I find myself, quite drawn into this mode. If I don't write about my feelings in my poems, I don't know what to write about. I mean, the spark that you had, right, when you start the poem, it's from a feeling, right? You could argue that it's from a memory, but come on, you feel for the memory, that's why you start, right? So that's what I think, but it's always about how sentimentality is made interesting to the reader, or in the writing process that excites you. That matters. That I agree. Sentimentality is important. Feelings are important.
The word that comes to my mind is tantrum. So I'm back to the angry child, right? That like you're a kid and you're like you don't have the words for it and you just like you're on the floor and you are just like turning and making a mess about things. I mean that for me continues to be like an inspiring scene of what good poems can do. You cause a ruckus, right? In a way that sometimes language, that's why you need to break the line. That's why you need to like morph it, because like the regular sentence just won't do and you're feeling something that needs to find form, right? And that's where it starts. I agree with you, Nick. That's real. It starts and ends there, right? Like, yeah.
Sometimes. Testing. So people bake. People write songs. People write poems. People paint. Just trying to, find a form for the feelings. Yeah.
People ask questions.
Yes.
I think we're ready for questions from you if you have some. I think we have the same system of microphones, so maybe if one of you guys can lend a mic. Thank you. Questions about baking, so other topics.
Thank you so much. I am actually a stress baker, so that's very funny. I actually was wondering, it's less about the Asia and diaspora part, but more about the Englishes part for Nicholas. Is I really enjoy reading taboo stuff in poetry. So when we kind of have this kind of vulgarity and sex, and you're talking about like using lube in art, I think that's really, really interesting. And I'm kind of wondering how or if you process that as a type of English to be using, this something you're not meant to say and then saying it.
But they're recording. Yeah, or yeah.
Whatever it is you're comfortable saying.
Why? Can I ask why? Why does that excite you?
I think there's something unfamiliar about it, and I quite like
Oh.
reading the unfamiliar in some way.
Okay. I can recommend other poets that write about vulgar stuff in a very interesting way. For one, I think I love Timothy Liu. I love Timothy Liu's homoerotic poems. Sorry, Wong's poems also very nice, very good. Maybe not as vulgar, but I think um, when you say vulgar, from the perspective of a writer, I think it's about honesty. If I'm concerned with private parts, then I would say private parts. I don't have I don't have anything to say about a park, or the mountains or clouds. I don't. I have my own concerns. I want to write about them in an interesting way. So sometimes they could be vulgar, and also because I'm a vulgar person as well, maybe. But yeah, I'm also drawn to that. Not that I'm writing about them for the sake of shocking the readers, but those are my concerns. Yeah, yeah.
So I want to ask a question about something Mr. Wong mentioned in the beginning of the panel, which is writing about poetry that are not limited only to identity or culture. So I have this question. So it is kind of an extension from our class. Is identity and linguistic poetics really like binary or oppositional? Because we have kind of discussed that on the one hand, like people would expect Asian American writing to be autobiographical, like limited to identity and personal experience. And on the other hand, like a lot of experimental literature, or they will view writing about culture and identity as inferior, like something as pure poetry. And kind of Professor Dorothy have mentioned that a poet have talked about he feels sorry for people who can only write about identity and culture. So, so this is my question: like, is literature, like pure literature and culture, politics, identity, really like binary and like separated, or they're actually like integrated, or there are no differences, or there's no superiority or inferiority in them? Yeah.
So you're asking, sorry, I don't quite get what the binary is.
So you talked about, so you really wish that, is there another way to write about poetry for Asian Americans that are not limited to their identity and culture? But I'm just wondering that maybe that's maybe that is their concern. Like, and they can maybe freely write about their concerns, because
Definitely.
Miss Prajita Sharma is actually here today, and we learned in class that she originally did not write explicitly about politics and about racism, but after she experienced some very harsh racism in America, like, and then she decided to write very explicitly about it. So, so I'm just wondering about this question on poetry and politics and identity. Yeah.
Let me just clarify myself a little bit more. When I said that, I was looking for a newer way. I was curious about whether there's another way of writing about the Asianness without treating your homeland, home culture, mother tongue, that kind of stuff, as a spectacle. Because I found that there's a very I said that because there could be a newer way. There could be a new way. I truly believe that because people have been talking about something like that for so long already. And I think that has something to do with age as well. So this is something I have to ask myself as I grow older. Besides having written about language and culture, being between languages and things like that, what can I still write about? Is there anything in my life I want to write about? And if so, what are they and how am I going to write about them? So if I'm thinking about these questions, I also ask myself if other poets are also thinking about the same questions. They could write about, let's say, language dilemma being between identities in the 20s or 30s. But what if when you're in your 40s and 50s, are you still concerned with these things? If so, then how are you going to renew the subject? I'm curious about not just the thematics, but how the thematics are written about. You know what I'm saying? So, so that's what I wanted to say, with that remark at the opening. Politics or not, city or not, I think everything. I once got asked, if a gay poet or queer poet, what do you usually write about? Then the answer should be, if I write about a pen, and that line is from me, then there is a gay poem, there's a gay line, even though it's still about pen. Although, you can take a pen as a phallic symbol, but how can I write about the clouds, that's phallic, the screen, something like that. It's just with me at some point, if you want to put label in that sense. But so whatever happens in a region, socially, culturally, or politically, I think the sentiment gets reflected in the poetics of the poet. If you get what I mean, I can't say things even more clearly.
Actually, I did want to say something
Yeah.
about that remark because
Sure.
I have to mount a defense of Asian American poetry because actually Asian American poetry for many decades or even a century is very varied. So there's a lot of stuff that doesn't just do my homeland, my mother, eating around a table. So, there are many poets who are writing in the 70s, 80s, 60s, even before in the 1920s, that weren't actually doing that kind of identity poem. So I think that's a certain stereotype of an Asian American poem because Meimei Burstenberger doesn't do that. John Yao doesn't do that. Yone Noguchi in the 19-teens wasn't doing that. So I think we have to be a little careful here because actually lots of canonical white poets write about identity, but we don't call it identity, right? So Ezra Pound writes about identity. That's what the cantos are, right? Lynn Haginian's My Life is all autobiographical, right? So I think we have to be a little more nuanced here about Asian American poetry is extremely varied linguistically, aesthetically, and I don't see a problem with someone in their 80s writing about their homeland or trauma or war or whatever. But it's a certain way in which Asian American and minority poetry has been stereotyped as being very representational, autobiographical, boring, identity-based, and it's not actually true. So it's mainly coming from white critics, I would say, that have so I think it's quite complicated. So you can do a very interesting poem about identity and one's homeland and one's mother and use incredibly experimental language and also be very political. So I don't think it's really that opposed. Like we move beyond that or we have to outgrow that, So that's just because I think, Asian American poetry in English actually started in the 19th century with Sadakichi Hartman. People don't realize how old it is. It didn't start in the 70s or even the 2000s, So I just have to say that.
Thank you so much. So hi, I'm actually Fanuyer from CityU. So I'm really excited to hear about your opinions on what are the limitations of using poetics in visualizing your hometown or city. Because currently I'm also doing two modules that's very relevant to this, like Asian literature and also like literature in the city, right? And I'm fascinated by how it is illustrated, but since I mostly focus on prose novels, right? I want to hear a perspective on poetry. Like, what are their strengths and what are the limitations in expressing like visual spaces?
Can you maybe ask one more question about that? Are you asking what's hard about it or what's fun about it or?
What's fun about like writing your hometown using poetry specifically?
I see.
But at the same time, do you feel that there's anything that is not captured well enough in your form?
Got it. Yeah. Um, Maybe as a way of answering, the last two chapbooks were about the house. So the sentimental is mother's house. Ventanilla actually is also my father's house. So it's a I didn't realize I was working on ancestral home projects, heritage projects, but the weird heritage projects. I think poetry, for lack of a better word, allows a weirdness to approaching it. I say that because I think there's a strong tradition, especially in the essay form, the personal essay or nonfiction, where you approach the parents' ancestral home with reverence. And you need to write it in like the most respectful way. You can't really offend people. So there's that tradition in prose. In poetry, I'm not sure if such a tradition exists. At least I don't. Nothing comes to mind. But I always feel like there's a bit more leeway in approaching the house in a way that's not through the front official door. Whether that be through the back door or through one of the windows or one of the more like minor characters. Maybe I'm generalizing, but in fiction and nonfiction, there might be more deeply settled ways of writing about heritage, whereas poetry, I think, can be a bit more leeway. When writing about my mom's home, there's a part here where I'm reminded about how every time we visited my grandmother, my mom would comment on my grandmother's furniture. They had very different like aesthetic tastes. So my mom did not like some figurines that my Lola really liked. And there was like this figurine of a cat that my mom would always say like put to the closet, like cannot be in the living room. But every time we would go back, the cat would be back. So I knew my grandmother really liked that really tacky kitschy figurine of a cat. And I think that's part of what I write about. And I'm like on the side of my grandmother, actually. I think like we should put as much kitschy stuff as we want to. That's our house, right? So that's always been a memory where I felt like I resented my mother for doing that, for like telling my grandmother to like fix the furniture, which becomes an interesting point in the house, right? Because she's ready to sell the whole stuff. Actually, it's like a major send this whole house out. And maybe I'm a bit like on the side of my grandmother's like, no, 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 you have to keep the kitschy stuff, the corny stuff. So maybe that's my way of answering that question, maybe. I don't know if that's a difficulty. I think it's more like a fun aspect of it. Yeah, I don't think it's a limit. It's an opportunity. Yeah. I think there were more.
I just have hi, I'm Diane. I have a question about translated works. So just now Lawrence mentioned how when your works translated in Sabunwa, you discovered this angry inner child of yours there. So because sometimes when we look at translated works, we might focus too much on the loss in another language. But then could there be some kind of gain as a writer, as a poet, to what extent do you allow your works to be reworked in another language that you are not familiar with? So how's your relationship with the translator then? Okay. Yeah, did I make myself clear?
For me, like my relationship to graphic designers also, I would prefer that they have complete control over the thing. I feel like that's part of the collaboration I really respect and I enjoy. Like, this is what I've done. Do what you need to do. Follow your own feelings. And then maybe we can meet later on to talk about it. But I don't want to be part of that initial move. So I always feel like making sure they have a kind of authority over something that I've written. And maybe that's the deal, right? As the author or maker of the thing, you give them the authority. That's where the generosity comes in. Like you say, do what you need to do. And then let's meet up along the way, and hopefully we'll still be friends after all of this. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, I guess we have only 10 minutes left. So, how many questions are still on the floor here? One, Elmo, and anyone else?
I have a question for Nicholas. And you just talked about the honesty in choosing your language use. But you've also said in one of your interviews that you sometimes you remake the real life stories to make it a poem. So I wanted to know, how do you always balance honesty and lies in your creation? Yeah, so I think lies are also important in poetry creation.
It's a very difficult question. Was it Mary Jean Chan that said, poets are liars, poems are lies. I think she said that, but in a classroom setting, when I was doing MFA with her. Fictional. But I don't know. Lies is very difficult. But you can still be honest with lies. I think at some point, poems are, to me, at least for my poems, they are to a certain extent autobiographical. But of course, there are lies there, but lies are fun to play with. Yeah, that's all. It's hard to say, a balance. Does the balance do the poem any good? Why do I have to achieve a balance anyway? But to say lies, I think is a way to unlock creativity when a poet is stuck. Yeah.
Just briefly, this also reminds me of what Will said about fabrication. I mean, there's an invented brother in your book. It's not a real person. Like, what does that make possible? But fabrication brings out the sense of a craft, I guess, right? Like a making, a faking, which is it's an act of making something real.
Yeah, so my questions, so first of all, thanks for the enjoyable conversation. And my questions about diasporic poetry. So actually this is more for Larry. Because from listening to the conversation earlier this morning, I think the poetry, we could see how poetry is, of the two speakers earlier, you could see that it's been shaped by their experience of being either in the US or in the UK. And so I was hoping that maybe Larry, if you wanted to talk about how your more recent work is shaped by your experience being in Singapore, because based on your discussion, Singapore doesn't really figure into the discussion. And I think it's a question I've asked you before. So like, a Singapore home, or is your decision to then focus on Cebu a response to you being in Singapore for these past years?
Good question. I have not yet written about Singapore fully, I feel, and it makes me wonder whether, I don't know if that will only happen if I leave it. Who knows? I have to say that the experiment was completed in Singapore, the book. So while it was kind of like already in my head when I was in the US, I think it actually needed me to like sit down, and the sitting down of it actually happened in Singapore. So while it doesn't figure on the page, there's something about me being there that I think allowed me to complete the book. I actually wrote a good part of it on bond paper by hand in hawker centers. And I have to look at Cyril at this moment, because Cyril, it's the first hawker center you brought me to when I first moved to Singapore. The Clementi one, the one in the corner that no one really goes to, next to the interchange. That left, and so I met up with Cyril on that very first week, and that's where we first met in the flesh, face to face, and that's where experiment got completed. Just I don't think I've told you that. I literally remember the night it was like done. Like my body knew like I am done. Around 6 p.m., 7 p.m., sunset in Singapore. It's around 7. Gathering a sheaf of paper because you don't use laptop in hawker center, right? You don't, you just don't do that, right? So that was one of the limits that I could not use my laptop in a hawker center. Or people would stare at me, right? And I can't write on my phone. So old school, bond paper, pen and paper. And I knew that, I think I was working on sequence. And I knew I had found the sequence that the book would fall. And, no, that evening when I walked out of that, I was like, what a great feeling, right? You're done with the book. Who cares if anyone else likes it? But your work has been completed. I am not answering your question, Elmo. I think it will take. Maybe I'm partly serious when I say it's only when I maybe leave Singapore when I will begin to write about it. Yeah, I'm also not sure what I might say about Singapore. If they might deport me if I might hold a tantrum, right? And just like let things come out. There's something about being back in Southeast Asia that was important to me when I left the States and went back to Southeast Asia. Being now, I mean, like even from yesterday being in Hong Kong, I've been texting Nick and Collier. I was just like, I love the energy of Hong Kong. Hong Kong was like the place that most Filipinos would try to like do a summer vacation in because like the weather was really nice. So in the 80s or 90s, that's what Hong Kong was to many Filipinos. Like my childhood is shaped, but by that idea of Hong Kong, of shopping and haggling, and the weather. So like even yesterday, being in the train and just like that Hong Kong draft almost. And what does it mean to be a Filipino and to write about Hong Kong? There's hardly anything written about that. So it's that. I think being back in the region has made me think about the important perspectives we bring to the different countries that we visit or pass through, because these are perspectives that don't get written about. Like a Filipino in Singapore, a Filipino in Hong Kong, like who knows what we would say or see, right? But we have something to say or see, but like, I think that's part of the possibilities of being back here.
I think we'll wrap up. Please take a look at the books out there and remember to give us some feedback. There are also hard copies of those feedback forms. And I hope we will see you tomorrow at 9:30 early. And join us then, please, for Mary Jean Chan and Concertina Cruz. For your turn. Thank you.